As in other countries, Elvis's mid to late 1960s soundtrack albums didn't sell very well in Japan. However, in 1982, 9 of them were re-released in a series. But there was a big problem with the artwork, and I'm going to show those albums to you today. Those 9 albums were actually part of a series of 10 LPs, the first of which was this one here. And this is a Japan-only compilation, Follow That Dream, Viva Las Vegas. And it contains all the Follow That Dream songs on side 1, plus, what did I say? And on the B side, it has 7 songs from Viva Las Vegas. It has the title song, the 4 songs from the EP, as well as Santa Lucia and, what's the last song? The Yellow Rose of Texas and The Eyes of Texas. So it doesn't have the 2 duets with Anne Margaret, and it doesn't have Nightlife or Do the Vega. All the albums in this series had this same yellow obi design with this picture of Elvis at the top from the Viva Las Vegas era, and the white text in this blue ribbon here reads Elvis on Screen 1800, and the 1800 refers to the price, 1800 yen. Regular albums were priced at about 2,500 yen at the time, so this was obviously a budget series of albums. The other 9 albums were all being released in Japan for the first time with the American artwork. The first time round, the front covers had mostly been the same as the American versions, but the back covers were usually different. So for instance, this original copy of Girls, Girls, Girls had this cover here with mostly Japanese text on the back cover and the black and white photograph. And the mid-60s albums came in gatefold covers, which allowed them to use the American back cover photographs, like here on this Harem Holiday album. But if you look at the titles at the bottom there, you can see that the titles are all in Japanese. So going back to 1982, Victor in Japan was reliant on RCA Victor in America for the artwork for these albums, because they wanted to release them with the front and back American artwork. However, when it came time to print these covers in Japan in 1982, they didn't have all the artwork for all of the albums. Some of them they didn't have. So what they proposed to do was use the original American LPs owned by the president of the Japan fan club. Now, I don't know which ones were released using his original albums and which ones were released using the artwork from RCA in America, but it's interesting to speculate by comparing those 1982 albums with American albums from the 60s and 70s. So that's what we're going to do now. By the way, I'll talk a little bit about the sound and the albums that they rejected for this series near the end of the video. The first of those 9 albums was Girls, 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 and I have here the Japanese version from 1982 and also a mono American album from the early 60s, 1962. And the quality of the photograph on the American original is noticeably better than on the Japanese version from 1982, even though my particular copy has some ringwear on it. And especially on the back, the American original photographs are much clearer. This one here on the Japanese back cover looks quite grainy in comparison with this one here. And it's a similar case with the album jackets at the bottom of the cover. The American ones are much clearer than the ones on this one here, the Japanese cover. So I would hazard a guess that this is one of those albums that they hadn't received the artwork for from RCA Victor in America. The next one in the series was It Happened at the World's Fair, and the one that I've got from America to compare it to is this copy from 1977. In this case, the front covers are really nice in both cases. Obviously, the American one here, as you'd expect, is very high quality front cover. But also the Japanese one is almost as good. Not really a problem with that one. If you turn over to the back cover, the picture here on the Japanese back cover is slightly grainy, not quite as good as that one, but pretty much even, I'd say, these two. So with this one, I can't really be sure. They may have had the American artwork from RCA Victor, and perhaps the slightly inferior quality is due to printing directly onto the cardboard as opposed to printing on slicks like they did here. But pretty much even, I'd say, with these two. The next one is Kissing Cousins. This is the Japanese one from 1982, and the one that I have to compare it to is this. I think it's from the mid-1970s. It's a tan label, but the inner sleeve goes up to 1972. So I'm guessing it might be from about mid-70s. The Japanese cover on this one is really, really clear. Very, very nice, clear image there. The one on the American version is slightly darker, but just as sharp. Same with the group photo as well at the bottom. The one on the Japanese cover is slightly lighter, but they're about as clear as each other. And if we go to the back, on the Japanese one, they seem to have lightened the pictures very slightly, so you can see more detail. So in fact, of the two, I would probably say that the Japanese one looks slightly better. So this one certainly seems to have been an album where they did receive the artwork from RCA Victor. This is not the original American one, so I'm not sure if this is as good as the original one from the 60s, but of these two, the Japanese one actually looks slightly better. The next one in the series was Roustabout, and this is one of the albums that just by looking at the front cover, you can see that there's something not quite right about it. And you can actually see there are two photographs of Elvis on the front cover of Roustabout. The small one in the background, in this case, it looks more like a drawing than a photograph. And here I'm comparing that to this original mono pressing, American mono pressing. And this one is much clearer, really nice sharp images on the front. Even the small picture of Elvis there in the background, you can tell it's a photograph, it doesn't look like a drawing. So the image on the Japanese cover here, it's not anywhere near as sharp as the one on the American cover here. And it's the same with the back cover. The pictures on the Japanese copy of Roustabout here, they're quite fuzzy compared to these sharp, clean images on the back cover of this American copy. So as with Girls, 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 I would definitely suggest that this is one of those albums that they didn't have the artwork for. The next one is Girl Happy. This is the Japanese one, and that's a nice clean image there. And the American copy that I have to compare it to is another mono one from 1965. Not much to choose between these two. And even the back cover of the Japanese version, this little picture of Elvis pasted onto this boat picture, it's fine. There's not really much to choose between these two. So I would suggest that they use the RCA Victor USA artwork for this album. The next one in the series is Harem Scarum. This was the first time that this album was released in Japan with the American title. Not only the artwork, but the title also was the same for the first time. I'm going to be comparing that with this 1977 pressing from America. The Japanese front cover has a very nice, sharp, clear image, as does the American version from 1977. Nothing really much to choose between these two. On the back cover, however, just like with the Kissing Cousins album, they have made the images a little bit brighter on the Japanese cover. So you can just see a little bit more detail in the Japanese cover. So it's pretty close, but I would say that the Japanese one is, if anything, slightly better. And it seems to me that they actually had the American artwork to work from when they were making this cover. Next one is Paradise Hawaiian Style. This is the Japanese one from '82. And the copy I have to compare it with is this mono American album from '66. Again, the front cover's not really much to choose from, really. If I had to choose one, I'd say the American one is slightly better, but there's really not much to choose from. The back cover, a lot of small pictures here, so even the American album, they're not perfect, but they are slightly better than the images on the back cover of the Japanese pressing. Also, the images of Hawaii are also slightly sharper than the ones on the Japanese cover. So again, it's difficult to tell with this one. Perhaps they had the original artwork and the slight differences could be just from printing straight onto the card. I'm not sure. There's definitely differences in the next pair of albums. So this is Frankie and Johnny. the Japanese version from '82, and I have another mono pressing from America to compare that with. And you might be able to see, even just there on the screen, that the American picture is much sharper, much crisper than the Japanese one. The back cover too, although the pictures are slightly dark on the American cover, they're still sharper than the ones on the Japanese version. So again, I'm guessing that this is one of those albums where they didn't have the original artwork to work from. So you end up with this slightly fuzzy front cover image. They're not particularly bad. It's not like they're as bad as, you know, covers that were coming out of South Korea and Taiwan in the 60s. But, you know, this is Japan, so you expect a little bit better. But since they didn't have the artwork to work from, I suppose this was the best they could do. The last one in the series was Spin Out. And just like Harem Scarum, this album was appearing for the first time with the American title. It had always been called California Holiday before this 1982 release. And unfortunately, I don't have an original American album, but I do have this copy from 1977, which has a really nice cover. The picture quality on this American front cover, just like all the others, is very, very good. However, the one on the Japanese cover is also really good. It certainly matches the American one, I would say. And on the back cover, just as with Kissing Cousins and Harem Scarum, the Japanese have lightened the photographs slightly so that they are actually a little bit clearer. You can see a little bit more detail in the Japanese one. So I will probably actually give this one to the Japanese cover. So they must have had the American artwork to work from in the case of this album. So it's a mixed bag. 3 are definitely inferior to the American versions. 2 of them are, if anything, slightly better, and 4 are about the same. As for the sound, well, I actually listened to quite a few of these albums using headphones, and I hadn't used headphones for many, many years. And what I will say is that there isn't really any noticeable difference in the mixes. The Japanese versions are slightly more middly, if I can put it that way. Or to put it another way, the American versions are slightly bassier. It's not that there's too much bass on the American albums or too little on the Japanese versions. It's just that they're slightly different. It's not the kind of thing you would particularly notice unless you are using headphones like I was, or unless you have an amazing system or bionic ears. There was one thing that I definitely did notice, however, and that was the Japanese vinyl was noticeably quieter than the American vinyl. And what I mean by that was, when I was listening to the American records, there was like a rumble in the background. You can't hear it when the music is playing, but it's just a slight rumble that you can hear, or perhaps sense is a better word, at the beginning and at the end and in between songs, like a rumbling noise. You don't get that with the Japanese albums. You'll have noticed that not all of the soundtracks from the 60s were included in that series. The big albums like Blue Hawaii, GI Blues and Fun in Acapulco, they were still available, so that's probably why they were not included in that series. However, the very last Elvis soundtracks from the 1960s, they were really poor sellers in Japan, and I'm talking about Double Trouble, Clambake and Speedway. So they just ignored those albums when re-releasing this series. Those albums were available up to around about 1975, certainly no later, and they've never been seen since. Okay, if you have any questions or comments about this series of releases or anything related to Japanese Elvis releases, just drop me a comment. I'm always glad to hear from you. Thanks a lot for watching. See you next time. Cheers.